Good afternoon. My name is Swati Taneja, and as a Training Production Director with Informa, I'm delighted to welcome all our attendees today on a very informative topic of our webinar, which is Why Doesn't Anyone Like Auditors? Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Before I begin, a few rules for the housekeeping for the next 45 minutes. The slides will be available on our SlideShare page, and the link will be emailed to you in the next couple of days. The recording of the webinar will be available to download, and the link will be emailed to you by next week. Please take the time to complete a post-webinar survey that will pop at the end of the webinar. You can always type your questions throughout the session, and time will be allocated in the end for the speaker to address your questions. The webinar will be led by our very popular trainer, Phil Griffiths, who is the founder and managing director of Business Risk Management Limited. He's a chartered accountant who has over 25 years experience in risk management, internal audit and fraud prevention as a practitioner, professional advisor, facilitator and a trainer. He has held top management positions with a number of international groups in roles embracing finance, IT, and general management. With that, I hand over to your webinar leader for the afternoon, and I really hope you enjoy the next 45 minutes to an hour.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome everybody. I hope you're going to enjoy this webinar. As Swati has said, my name's Phil Griffiths. I deliver the Audit series of training courses for Informa. Many of you may have seen some of the brochures for that. What I picked as a topic here is probably one that most auditors and other people in the organization certainly recognize. I'm hoping that it's not absolutely true that people don't like auditors at all, but for those of you who are in internal audit or compliance or do the ISO or health and safety assessments, part of the problem, as I'm sure you're aware, is that people don't necessarily welcome you with open arms to come and carry out the roles. Is it because they don't understand what you do? Is it because maybe they misunderstand the different roles? Is it because the audits tend to focus on negatives, problems, difficulties, as opposed to the positive aspects that people in audit really need? I've been working in the internal audit field now for a very large number of years. I've managed 3 global internal audit functions, and everybody tells me, as I found at that point, that audit is never something that people say, oh good, we're going to have an audit. Now this webinar is trying to sort of highlight maybe what you can do about it. What are the actions you can take? Part of the problem is, I think in some cases people feel that the audit will cause disruption, that you get in the way. The other thing they probably think is, why do we need another audit? We've just had somebody in here a month ago or 2 months ago, and why do we need another one? So that's the dilemma, and that's the bit I'm going to try and sort of deal with, and hopefully give a few solutions, ideas through that. Please, through the webinar, if there's things that occur to you, write a question down. I'll come to these at the end. I won't sort of go through those as you highlight them, but any view, comments you have, just make a little note of it, and we'll have time at the end to be able to discuss it. So the first thing here is, what does it mean to be an auditor? Many of you, I know, will be working in the audit field or even receive audit. Now, I put a few pictures up on this particular slide, and the first one really, as I suppose, is to say, are auditors scanning the horizon, the top left there, which arguably they should be. I always maintain that you can't really change what's gone. You can only influence the future and the things that are going to happen. So the view now, I think, from an audit point of view, is very much to say, shouldn't we be focusing on the issues forward rather than back? The second one, I guess, is sometimes one of the problems with audit is the words that are used. And maybe my top right little picture there is meant to indicate findings. Now, I'm a great believer that the word findings can create a problem, because I think if people just think this is a negative word, which I think they do, they're looking for, why could we look at opportunities? Isn't it possible for us to look at areas which perhaps are well managed? Findings tend to be a very negative word in my view. What's gone wrong, and we're going to find something if it kills us. So I tend to think maybe if audit and compliance, etc., because the word non-conformance, while of course it's a word that people in compliance have to use, or do they, tends to find a very negative connotation to the people receiving it. Also, now we have technology available. And I suppose this webinar is an example of that. Why shouldn't auditors be able to analyze things more rather than necessarily have to always be in people's area doing the audit? Maybe you can do this from a different point. You don't necessarily need to be physically in their area, particularly with the use of the audit tools that tend to be available now on the market, the likes of ACL, IDEA, and similar products. But of course, the audit role is, as the bottom right demonstrates, it is a bit like being on a flying trapeze. There is a danger you could fall down. It's a tough role. Everybody knows that. And it doesn't matter whether you're doing health and safety assessments or internal quality audits and whatever. The problem is you're entering their territory. And the difficulty is, of course, that they may feel that's not the ideal thing for them. So how do we actually move on from there? This doesn't seem to be moving. Let's get the next slide up there. The next slide doesn't seem to be appearing. Technology is great when it's working, isn't it? Okay. So the first thing, I suppose, is to say, how do you explain the role? I'm just going to try and adjust this microphone because it's making a noise. Sorry about that. That seems to be okay now. If somebody asks you, could you easily explain the role of your function? Now that sounds a very straightforward question, but also the important bit is, what if somebody else is asked and maybe they give you a different, or you give a different answer? Now, each of your roles need to be professional, and I'm sure you would agree that. The problem is if somebody asks you and you give a completely different message, that doesn't come out as very professional. So do you have an agreed statement? Do you have something which you can use and every person, every auditor would automatically say the same thing when somebody asks? If not, I would suggest you should develop one. Because I think part of the problem is that if you try and explain it and the person's not sure, then that leads to doubt, misunderstandings, and separately. So I would say develop something, have an agreed statement that is approved by the head of your function, and maybe even higher than that, maybe the CEO, the board, or whatever. And then that means that you will at least cover the first challenge, which is, do you really understand it? What did they say? How is it changing? and you would say, well, oh, it's pretty much as it was. And they say, that's not the way I heard it. So we can look at these type of issues. The next one is really to try and deal with the wrong views about audit. Misconceptions are very significant in this area. People assume, and you probably have heard it, when people are, oh, auditors are there to increase controls. I tend to disagree with that. I think auditors are there to ensure an appropriate level of control. You certainly need to make sure that you don't keep suggesting more and more controls because they may serve no purpose. The second one is weaknesses. That's another word I really dislike, and I think you should remove from your, particularly from your reports, because the word weakness is such a negative word, and it's very difficult to get people to take that anywhere near positively. So if you can start talking about opportunities for improvement rather than weaknesses that have been identified, I think you get a different reaction from them, and maybe we start breaking down some of these barriers as to why people don't like the audits or the auditors. It's not the people, it's actually the process they don't really like, and maybe the words that are used. Third one, which again some auditors don't know, is you're not there to identify fraud. This is specifically excluded in the Institute of Internal Auditors standards. And unfortunately, many audit functions are caught in a trap because management think you are there to identify the fraud. And of course, that's not strictly true. You're not a detection mechanism, you're a prevention tool. So that, again, I think it's useful to have something which maybe has a separate document, which you can give out, which addresses these misconceptions before people have to ask them. The ones at the bottom, again, are not the right role for audit. You're not there to find management out. Your role isn't anything to do with people. It's more about process. And you should not mention the names of people, in my view, and also the IA's view, within the report, because that becomes too personal. Assessing the ability of staff, clearly that's way outside your role. How can you possibly assess someone's ability? That's not nowhere near the audit role in any shape. And unfortunately, some people tend to ask that. They tend to go, oh, could you have a look at this area and tell us whether you think we've got the right people? That's outside the brief of audit and really needs to be. Final two at the bottom point out problems. Well, wouldn't it be better to work through a solution? I think particularly with senior manager, they're not interested in another set of problems. They've got their own. And I think if you give them a pile of further problems, you're not doing yourself any great help. And I think that's a very important area. And then finally, of course, under no circumstance can you tell manager what to do. You can only suggest and recommend. I hear this phrase, you might have come across it, it is an audit requirement. Well, if you think about it, that has to be wrong. There can only be business requirements. There can't really audit requirements. It's not audit there to tell people what to do. You can only be there as an advisor, a suggester, etc. So there are a lot of misconceptions. For those of you who haven't got this, I would suggest you develop a schedule of these issues with the answers to those, and then hopefully that will help you to get your message over and people will understand you better. So that's another thing you can do. What I'm trying to do is highlight some of the practical aspects of this. The second thing you can have would be a series of FAQs. Obviously, these are tend to things that appear on an intranet. The first question, do you have an intranet page for your function? Now, I would say if you haven't, why not? And even though people might not necessarily initially want to come and look at it, you can have something maybe printed out to give to them if they want to. And I think this is the types of questions that people usually ask. What is audit? And then you can explain that, maybe have an agreed definition there. What are the internal audit responsibilities? And again, that's important that they recognize what your roles are and what you're not. Maybe the differentiation between your role and other assurance providers could be in there, because that's another thing they don't really understand. most people, with my experience, says if you ask them what's the difference in internal and external audit, they don't really know. What's the difference in internal audit, quality audit, or compliance? Usually that's poorly understood. So I think a bit of time spent on this to develop this is actually quite valuable. This whole area is things that we do include in some of the training courses, particularly the one I'm dealing with at the start of the series. Many of you might have seen the brochures of this. There's 5 courses in a row. I'll mention a little more about that at the end for those of you who haven't seen it. And this is something then that is produced, and I do produce schedules of this which you can have a look at if you wish to. Why do we need audit is another question. I suppose that's a leading question and you have to be careful you answer that one carefully. And I believe what we're talking about here is a function that can help assess the balance between risk and control, because the whole process of audit now is risk-based, and we need to make sure that. Another big question is what line management responsibility does the function have? And of course the answer to that really is none, because how can you be separate and independent if you do not have that separation? There's some very clear guidelines given, for example, between the difference in internal audit and risk management. Even if you do not have a formal risk management function, internal audit would not be allowed to have responsibility for the risk management activities. That would have to be allocated to somebody else within management. So there's the first set of FAQs, if you like. I don't know how many of your businesses have FAQs already. I'd be interested, if you would, to tell me whether or not this is something you do have, or if not, if it's something you would think is going to be valuable and you would think you want to develop. Other questions, of course, will be things like, are internal auditors professionals? Most people in organizations don't appreciate that audit functions are professional activities with standards, and I think it's important you would explain that to them. Right of access is another one. I'm sure many of you have come up with the dilemma that people say, oh, I'm not allowed to show you this. You can't go into this area. I think, again, that will be something in your charter that you would have, but I think it's very important to be able to explain in a document and something you can show to management, approved by the board and the audit committee if you have one, to show the right of access. And really that should be audit and other functions in the assurance arena can have access to anything they wish for the purposes of that audit. I think perhaps you will also have something there to say if it's extremely sensitive, it's fine for only senior management within the audit function have access to it. You wouldn't expect somebody brand new to be going looking at the most sensitive things. Can I request an audit? I think that's a good thing to put in here, because sometimes people don't think they're allowed to. And my view on that, why not? Why wouldn't you want? You can't guarantee you'd be able to say yes. Will I receive advance notice? I'd be interested also from your point of view, do you give advance notice or do you just turn up? When I mean advance notice, I don't just mean a few days. The advice now is maybe 3 to 4 weeks, which actually gives the audit customer time to prepare and hopefully a time to be thinking about the issues. And finally, you can ask, what can I do to facilitate the audit? Which means make sure the people are going to be there, extract the information as well. I think anything you can do to help them deal with these issues, and hopefully that will then break down some of these barriers further. These are typically the questions, in my experience, that most people who either don't appreciate audit or haven't received very many will be asking. So my view is hit them head on. The other one here, I suppose, is how does audit decide what to do? And again, you can have a little bit of an explanation there in terms of the audit process. Next one, I guess, would be audit observations. You know, are they a question of judgment? They shouldn't be. They should be based on fact. And I think, to me, the most important aspect of there is to really explain that to people, that within all these audit roles, you're dealing of facts and hopefully backed by evidence. Facts can't be questioned. Views can. So I think that's the other thing you would look at. Other aspects I've got here would relate to the results and how they're reported. People get very confused about that. Who receives it? Does my boss get it? Does my boss's boss get it? When did they get it? I think these are areas that are useful to explain. It doesn't need long explanations. It probably just needs a little paragraph for each one. We used to actually provide this out in a little booklet. So if people wanted to see it, they could. It doesn't need to be complicated or expensive. And we used to call it internal audit at your service to demonstrate that, you know, we are doing it for you, for your benefit. And then the final bit on here would be, how does audit differ from other activities? And that's a useful little session to try and explain the difference between internal and external audit, quality assurance and internal, etc. And it doesn't matter which of those functions that you work in, there's still a misunderstanding between those. I think sometimes even the functions themselves don't fully understand the others. So anything you can do here to have this in to explain better, I think gives you a fighting chance to be able to deal with that. So that's some things in, you know, the FAQs or something similar. The other thing you could also have is have maybe a little mechanism at the start of each assignment to explain what you're going to do. That doesn't need to be complicated. It doesn't need to be difficult. But the beauty of if you have a little mini presentation, this doesn't mean you stand up and tell people. You just say to the people, could you gather around and I will explain what we're going to do. That's quite useful. And I think that's we found that was very valuable because the beauty of that, whoever says it says the same thing. Maybe you need 3 or 4 slides, something like this, very, very simple. Mainly they're interested on the issues at the bottom here. How will disruption be minimized? How long are you going to be here? When are you going to leave? Now, obviously, you don't want to leave too much with that, but I think it is important you have those. It's the approach you're going to follow, and actually focusing on working together. I believe that if you are trying to do this, you're trying to market what you do. My experience is many audit functions don't sell themselves very well. And I think if you can focus on working together, I think that will help them to understand. You also need to demonstrate that you are doing it for their benefit. You're not doing it for your health. So there is a reason that they need to respond properly to the things you do, and of course within the right time frame. Interestingly, some audit functions have a service level agreement now with their customers. You know, I'm talking about customers, not clients or auditees. Some people use those words. Client sounds as though you're providing some external services. An auditee to me is, well, it's not even a real word. It's a made-up word. It's not in the dictionary. So customers gives a different relationship, doesn't it? You don't have to use these terms. I'm just trying to sort of give you a few thoughts, ideas into this arena. So, okay, if you generally do want to market the function, these are ways you can do it. I don't know how many of you do have an intranet for your own function. You can also have, of course, a main page on your main website if you wish to. That would tend to be very high-level things. But these things are useful, maybe, and perhaps will draw people in. Maybe the plans. Maybe you can publish your plans. Maybe not in great detail, but at least telling people what we're doing in the next 3 months, 6 months, or whatever. Maybe some testimonials, if you get any positive comments. Ask the person who gives it, would you mind us publishing that? Would you mind people? Because I find that you do some great roles and very important things, but nobody sees them. And they certainly don't know the benefits you deliver to others. Why not shout about them? And the achievements are like that. They would need to be supported achievements. I think it's good if you can get something maybe from a very senior person and a comment they make, which actually has an impact on other people then, doesn't it? You can also provide them information about other services you provide. Maybe you've got links here if they want to look at a manual or they want to know about a procedure or so on. You're not the guardians of those, but you can have maybe hyperlinks to those, etc. Some audit functions do awareness sessions, maybe about fraud or control or whatever it is. Maybe put those issues on there. Best practice ideas are one that I particularly like. You probably wouldn't want to publish your reports on here, although some audit functions do. I think I want to put some things that come from specific assignments which might have a benefit to other people in the organization. Because I think auditors are often criticized for keeping things to themselves. I think sometimes that's justified. So I think maybe we need to sort of think about that and maybe publish good ideas, not recurrent weaknesses. That's horrible. That's not going to help you market yourself, but putting best practice ideas where somebody can go on and say, we could do this. This will be something I can do. So there's some ideas here. The final one would be for performance management, the performance indicators for you as a function. Sometimes that's quite difficult. We cover these areas in our risk-based audit course, which I'm delivering next week and also in October. So a whole series. There's probably about 20, 25 KPIs you could use for each assurance function. This does not mean you need them all, but it's useful to develop some. So I think all those areas, rather than keep them to yourself, why not actually explain those and maybe put them on your own website. A brochure was the second one. If you have got a little brochure, this could be an electronic brochure, it doesn't have to be something you give out. If you can do it with your chief executive writing the first paragraph, that's going to add a huge amount of positives to it. And you might need to maybe write portions of that for the chief exec or your CEO, but if they're willing to put that in, that automatically means you're going to sort of have a different way of being thought of. There are various other ideas on here. You don't need to do all of them. Maybe occasionally go into a management meeting and just do a little 10-minute presentation. Don't explain how you did an audit. They're not interested. But you could certainly go, this is what's in it for you. Anything about marketing is not about what you do. It's what about you doing for them. What about internal audit being included in the induction program? People hear about other things in the business. Why not about the assurance functions? I don't see any reason why not. It doesn't need to be complicated. Just something simple. Maybe takes just 5 minutes, 10 minutes. That's all. And then hopefully people come in with a more positive view. A newsletter. Some organizations do a little newsletter. Don't do the day in the life of an auditor. That's probably not a good thing to have on there. But maybe just something where things you've done, areas you've been involved with which have received positive messages. And then the final one might be meet with the senior people. Not just when you're doing an audit, away from those, because I think that's helpful to actually give some positive messages. And hopefully, again, little by little helps people to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. Okay, so that's some of those things you can do. Other things about when you actually carry out your audits, what about then? Well, as you know, there is a requirement that certainly in internal audit, the approach is focused on the biggest risks. And this is a statement that's been made by the Institute of Internal Auditors, which basically says if you do not have a risk-based auditing approach, it's rather difficult to see how you can provide the level of assurance that management need, particularly senior management. So I think anything you can do to focus on the really important things to management, which therefore by definition are probably the key risks, will actually create focus for you and hopefully will help to be able to deal with that. This again is something that's developed quite a lot in our risk-based audit courses and also in the enterprise risk management. If we think about this, these are the elements and the questions which perhaps lead the risk-based audit approach. As you'll see, the best way to engage management is talk about something that's important to them. And that one at the top is the most important, isn't it? Their objectives, the business objectives, are not being audit objectives now. Ask them what's really important to them. What do they have to deliver? What are the measures that they have of performance? Which are those they're happy with, which they're comfortable with, which leads you into the next leg, which is the threats. So in other words, what are those areas that cause them concern, and you can give more attention to those. Anything you can do to get them to highlight things to you about areas that will make things better for them, you're going to break down the barriers and you will certainly have some success. So the traditional approach is to start with the controls. Well, that's not much good, is it really? Because if you talk about the controls, they go controls related to what? So you can see here, threat to achievement is another way of talking about a risk, but it relates directly to the objectives that are important to them. The third one, which is something that obviously requires a lot of explanation, and we don't have time this afternoon to do that, but it is something which I think is the most underestimated aspect of the risk process, is something called risk appetite, which typically is how much risk you want to take, would you be allowed to take, would be appropriate. And I think that's an area that needs a lot of attention. This is something that is developed in my courses on enterprise risk management and our quite new course on advanced ERM, which is actually being delivered next month. You can obviously look on the website and get all these outlines if you wish. If you think right towards the bottom here, what you're trying to do with this process is to assess how well the risks are being managed. And I think that's extremely important because then it puts it into context. Anything you can do to focus your attention on the risks and how they are being controlled, you're certainly going to be able to demonstrate to management that if you've followed this process, that you can think about what the risks are and more importantly what the objectives are. So that's a little bit, that's a very, very quick way, of course, of explaining the risk-based audit role. Other thing you can do, and this is crucial, I think, is to coordinate your role with other assurance providers. Bear in mind, of course, there are lots of people providing assurance, and the Institute of Internal Auditors requires internal audit to share information and coordinate activities with the other providers' assurance. As you will see here, both internal and external. So this could be your regulators, your internal audit, your external auditors, or maybe your external agencies that assess you. All of those are quite valuable, and I don't think that most organizations do enough in this area. They tend to say, oh no, we all do different things, but I think you want to try and get together and coordinate that. All it needs is meetings between the people, and hopefully that will help you to deliver a coordinated service. These are some of the providers. You may work in one of these aspects, and this tends to be called assurance mapping. And of course, to create a map and agree your plans together gives you a much better chance of, one, removing duplication and making sure there's the appropriate focus. So you may not have all these functions in your organization, but you'll certainly have some of them, and you could even put regulators on there if you wish to. So all this needs is the head of these functions to meet together maybe once a quarter, something like that, maybe share their information, share their ideas for the plans, and maybe create a plan which then demonstrates when each of these topics is going to be reviewed and who is going to look at them. So you can create a plan of each activity and, if necessary, publish that. And of course, that's going to mean that you avoid this situation where two assurance teams go in the same month, because as I'm sure you're aware, that's just awful, certainly for the people who are going to receive that audit. This doesn't have to happen. You can get together, and anything you can do on this will automatically cover one of those concerns that they often have. Why do we have all these teams coming in? Now, it doesn't mean you'll have less teams. It does mean you will coordinate that and hopefully deliver it at the same and not at the same time. So again, here's a question too. Do you get together? Do you share your plans? Do you coordinate your visits to keep disruption to a minimum? If not, excuse me, why not? What about sharing your reports? This is not external, it's internal. So, and some people say, oh, we can't do that. We can't share each other's reports. My view on that is, why not? Is there any reason why you can't? Maybe there's information that's extremely valuable to you to help you when you carry out your review if other people have actually done it themselves. The next question is, do you actually synchronize your objectives? Do you try and make sure that the best team with the most knowledge does the audit? An example of that, I guess, would be that can be even with external providers. if you happen to be an internal audit, do you want to go and look at financial statements? Because external audit have to do that. They're not allowed to rely on anybody else. So what's the point in you doing that as well? The final suggestion is maybe you can produce a consolidated report for the board, so of course they see something from each function as opposed to having to work it out themselves. That requires a bit more work, and certainly there's some specific actions you can take to be able to do that. What I'm trying to today is just give you a flavor for these issues, just to get you thinking about that. And if these are areas that you already carry out, that's fantastic. If not, maybe you need to consider some further actions to be able to do so. Okay, finally, I'm just going to ask you what else can be done. There are, of course, other ways you can deal with this. Bear in mind, all we're trying to do here is to make sure that people understand what you do and, if possible, of course, think better of you. And I think this is sometimes not that difficult, because quite often my experience is starting perhaps from quite a low base. Anything you can do is going to make a difference. The top one here is allocate points of contact with senior people, particularly heads of department. This doesn't mean it has to be the same person within your team that does that. You can allocate that between you, assuming, of course, you have enough people. This is sometimes a point of contact, or sometimes it's called an account management structure. So you build up an expertise and maybe meet those people once a month or once every 6 to 8 weeks. I would say the head of your function should meet with the CEO, and of course people within your team can be allocated points of contact within each activity, each function. And that's quite a useful thing to do, because then you hopefully will have somebody to bounce ideas off, and they will bounce ideas off you. Clearly here, one of the important aspects of this is to recognize that if they only see you whilst you do an assignment, it's a little bit negative. If they see you at other times, then maybe that's okay. Maybe you should also maybe think about joining with them in terms of social activities, or maybe helping them towards a charity effort as well, etc. Bear in mind, you do work for the organization in most cases, so why shouldn't you be seen to be? Okay, you need an independent role, but equally you also need to be somebody they can relate to. So I would think this: be available, be seen, maybe have something on your office door that is not sort of something you're ashamed of. Maybe have a logo, have something like this. Some audit functions do put on their door something which, helps people. Maybe have a little coffee morning, invite people in, say, come and have a cup of coffee with us. The problem is you'll know whether or not you're successful if anybody comes. So hopefully you get people who want to come along. So what I've tried to do in this sort of 40 minutes is really to give you some thought provokers, some ideas. I'd be very interested to get your views on this and your questions. Of course, you can sort of think about those. By all means, if you've got any questions, please do type those for me. Just finally, what I wanted to do is just to sort of mention the fact that these topics areas are covered to some degree or other in each of these aspects. On here are the dates of the courses I'm delivering within the audit series. And obviously, if you want to have more information on those, just go on to the website, and there's full details of each of those events. So what I would like to do now is to sort of open up for questions and comments if you have any. I appreciate this is a Thursday afternoon and you may not necessarily want to, you might want to get away. Thank you very much indeed for those of you who have listened into this webinar, and for those of you who have registered and are going to get the information afterwards. Same thing applies. If you do have any questions or comments from that, do please post something and then I will try and come back to you and give you some answers if you'd like to. I hope it's been thought-provoking. I hope it's been of interest to you. I'm looking at my list now of questions and comments, which means I have either given you the information you need and you don't need to ask anything, or alternatively, you you don't need any more information because it's Thursday afternoon and you want to get away. If there is anybody who would like to ask a question, please type one now. If you haven't, that's brilliant. Okay, that would mean you're happy with it. As I say, I hope I've sort of stimulated a bit of thought and thought process about this. Clearly, if you want to know more, then I would be delighted to see you and any of your team on any of my future events. Just going to wait a moment or two to see if anybody posts anything. It's okay, and there's no pressure to do so. It's perfectly okay. Excellent. Okay, so I think what we'll do therefore, as there doesn't seem to be any specific questions on that seminar, I'd like to thank you all very much for attending this webinar, and keep watching because I should be delivering another one within the next month or so. So just keep looking at the website. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I've just got a comment here from Nabil, Aziz Nabil, and there's a question here, just to say this seems to be the opposite of the way they've had experience with, which is great, isn't it, really? I'm hoping you're suggesting it is a positive thing I've been suggesting rather than a negative one. I'm trying to say that, you know, these aren't things that every audit function do, but hopefully I've given you some food for thought. I've just got another question from Mohammed Farhan Naz. And your question is what should be included in the service level of agreement for internal audit. There are quite a number of things you can put in there, particularly to realize that it is meant to be for management's commitment as well. I do have a document in terms of an example SLA if anybody would like one. And by all means we can sort of arrange that to be sent to you because these are all electronic documents. But typically things would be there, for example, how quickly you would you would issue your draft report, and therefore how quickly you would expect a response from that. Some people would put that in, so in other words, we'll try and get our report out within 3 days. We expect therefore you, if you can, to respond within a 3-day period as well. There's lots of areas in terms of the quality aspect of this as well. You don't want to get too complicated, but you do want to try and make sure, just as you would have an SLA perhaps with an external organization, just to try and make sure that management recognize that it's not just a one-way traffic. You're doing it for a reason, for their benefit, so you ideally want them to be able to deal with that. Maybe it can be some things, for example, about the access to documentation as well. And you would say, we will give you a schedule of the things we want to look at. Therefore, we would expect you to have those available for us at the start of the assignment. We'll give you 2 weeks' notice anyway to be able to do that. So issues like that are obvious things and logical things you can put in an SLA. But as I say, if anybody would like, we do have your details for those of you who have put your name down for this. Even if you're not actually listening now, but there's many, many people who have registered for this and you'll be getting the information. If any of those would like the information, just drop a note, an email on that, and I can certainly give you the information. I'm not sure, did my email address, was that on the first slide? It was. So you should have my email address on the first slide. Delighted to hear from you separately if you'd wish to do that. We're just going back to the first slide now, so you will all have a copy of this. Hopefully it's on there. There it is. This is my email address. So please do send me an email for those of you who would like a copy of an SLA or anything else that we've talked about here, maybe FAQs for your function, etc. Because they do have lots of information on these areas. Okay, so I think I don't want to sort of keep you. These are meant to be about 45 minutes, so we've got to the 45-minute level now. So I would like to thank you all very much for attending. I hope I've given you some food for thought, and I hope to hear you on a further webinar in the not too distant future. Thank you very much indeed. Have a great weekend. Thank you.